good afternoon on what is a changeable day. It's been raining, it's been overcast, it's been blustery, it's now just cloudy, spots of blue in the sky, and I'm out here with some parcels and a cat who is not ours, and of course a nice hot cup of tea. And I'm going to do some unboxing. So, it's Friday, October the 29th, and the first thing I'm going to unbox is this. So, let's see if I can find my way into this. What we've got is this Game Wizards, the epic battle for Dungeons and Dragons by Jon Peterson, who is the author of basically the Dungeons and Dragons Art and Arcana, which came out a couple of years ago or so. And if you've not seen that, and you're a fan of Dungeons and Dragons, go find a copy. It's fantastic. I mean, basically, it traces the style and influences of the artwork for Dungeons and Dragons throughout its 45 years of history, along with commentary and lots of stuff you haven't seen before, and it's very good. He's also the author of The Elusive Shift, which came out earlier this year, which it discusses the history, essentially the where we went from essentially looking as Dungeons and Dragons essentially as a variant of a war game to actually being a role-playing game, where that shift happened. And that's an interesting history because it reads very much like all of our entries into the hobby. What's it like? What are we doing? How do we do it? And so on. And what's the best game for us, that sort of thing, and essentially it's very readable. I've done an unboxing and a review of that already, and of course he is the author of Playing at the World, which is the big history of Dungeons and Dragons, which is his first book. So let's have a look. Let me see, this is published by the MIT Press, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So it's interesting that a body as august as that is taking an interest in the history of our hobby. And I'm going to say, well, so what we've got in the back. When Dungeons and Dragons was first released to a small hobby community, it hardly seemed destined for mainstream success. And yet this arcane tabletop role-playing game became an unlikely pop culture phenomenon. In Game Wizards, Jon Peterson chronicles the rise of Dungeons and Dragons from hobbyist pastime to mass market sensation, from the initial collaboration to the later feud with its creators Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. As the game's 50th anniversary approaches, and that's in 2024, Peterson, a noted authority on role-playing games, explains how D&D and its creators navigated their successes, setbacks and controversies. And essentially there's all of those, and of course many of those have been talked about and discussed throughout basically the gaming hobby, whether that's the basically involvement of the Bloom brothers in the running of Dungeons and Dragons, Gygax's essentially effective exile to Hollywood to work on other projects and essentially develop it as a media property, which resulted in the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. So he's not altogether unsuccessful. And then of course its later sale to Lorraine Williamson, trying to remember her name, I hope I've got that right. And essentially Peterson describes Gygax's and Arneson's first meeting and their work around toward the 1974 release of the game, the founding of TSR and its growth as a company, and Arneson's acrimonious departure and subsequent challenges to TSR. He recounts the satanic panic accusations that D&D was sacrilegious and dangerous, and how they made the game famous. So there is a particular book there which isn't about the the Satanic Panic, but is a particular. I think it's called the Dungeon Master or something like that. I can't remember exactly the title, but it's about the disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III in the late 70s, and how that was connected to his playing of Dungeons and Dragons. And that's an interesting book because it's a read, because it's written by the private detective who investigated his disappearance, William Deere. And so it's written from a point of view of someone who doesn't know anything about the hobby, and of course makes lots of assumptions, and then of course that would influence the book and film Mazes and Monsters, the film being Tom Hanks, one of Tom Hanks' first roles. And I think and again, essentially, and the controversies linked to those, because essentially they all kind of cast Dungeons and Dragons in obviously a controversial and incorrect light, as it were. So with Game Wizards, Peterson restores historical particulars long obscured by competing narratives spun by the one-time partners. That record amply demonstrates and it's Lorraine Williams, I believe, how the turbulent experience of creating something as momentous as Dungeons and Dragons can make people remember things a bit differently from the way they actually happened. So, we have a history of essentially the first sort of first 20 years or so of Dungeons and Dragons, as basically as it's not been told, but through going through the records and tying up the details and so on. And Peterson has been essentially forensic in his previous works, looking at particular documents and letters and so on, talking about particular aspects of the rules and how they came into play. So he's got a blog, and if you go there, and you'll see discussions of these topics, and it's interesting from that point of view if you have an interest in the history of the hobby at all, because whether you like it or not, Dungeons and Dragons is the history of the hobby. Many things have spun out of it, but here's where it started first, and essentially Dungeons and Dragons will influence the hobby for decades. It's not as big as in some ways it's not as big an influence as it once was, but it's incredibly popular today. And its influence is in the sense that lots and lots of people play it, and then many of them go on to create or play other games with any luck. And I'm not saying you shouldn't play Dungeons and Dragons. I'm saying there's a wide swathe of role-playing games out there which are equally as fun to play, if not more so. So. If we open up on here, what we've got is, that's a really nice map, of the area where Dungeons and Dragons was born, and that's done in the style of a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, and it's a lovely touch. I'm just looking at that, it almost echoes the. Is it Masters of GW1, Masters of the Black Hand, or whatever it's called, or Famranagago, essentially, which takes place in a Gamma World analogy of this of the Michigan Peninsula. So we get into the history itself, and it basically starts off with, in the fall of 1985, Ernest Gary Gygax was the most famous and powerful figure in the hobby gaming, and that's certainly true. His influence can't be denied, and he would fall, basically he would always remain there, and essentially he is a leading figure. And we've got nice illustrations in here, many of which will have been reprinted from other sources, but again, if you're doing history of Dungeons and Dragons, it's always worth going back to this. And what's this has resonance essentially in that for the 50th anniversary of Gen Con, the organisers put on a recreation of the original Gen Con War Games convention at the Horticultural Hall And if you're at the convention, you could go around and have a look, and that was really. I've got some photos of that, which I took at the time, and it was great to see that and see so many games that that we've all played and know about, and in some cases even had a hand in here and there, and that was really fun. So this is. It's fairly dense text, you know. There's not a huge amount of illustrations. I mean, because it is a history book. Just flipping through. I mean, so this is a book that I really to sit down and read. And here we have. So we have actual documentation. So this is the Tactical Studies Rules Copyright Assignment and Royalty Agreement for Dungeons & Dragons, executed on January 4th, 1974. So again, researched and attribution included. And interesting, we have a handwritten tabulation of Dungeons & Dragons sales for the first quarter of 1974, broken down by job lot, wholesale, retail sales, with royalty payment similar for Dave Arneson. So, looking at that, 1974, by that point it had sold, let me see, 65 plus 65, 81 copies, for which Arneson was received $52. So this essentially is more or less. This is probably more of a companion to, I would say, Peterson's Playing at the World. And again, we have confidential destroyer for reading, an estimate of the financial status of Tactical Studies Rules in basically a year later in 1975. Again, not handwritten, hand annotated, written out, much more organised on sort of like professional footing, as it were. And again, revised copyright. And this is all important because it sort of like tracks the record, it tracks the relationship between Arneson and Peterson and Gygax throughout the period. And essentially, basically brings it to life. And that's going to be interesting because essentially this revises that relationship in many ways, from what I've read about the book. But I'll obviously discover for myself when it comes to proper review. And then essentially, we have a little note there about the TSR results for 1977. And then essentially the product we all know and love, sort of like coming out in 1977. And essentially that was really my first experience with Dungeons & Dragons, that version, the BX version. And although I did play sort of like the Frank Menser bet me design version as well, because obviously that's next. But that's the kind of version I have a fondness for, and I'm playing in an Old School Essentials campaign, which is using those BX rules. So, okay, we have the basic illustrations of the Bloom brothers, and then obviously a discussion of their influence on the company. And they were supposed to rescue the company, but ultimately they would lead to its sale. And it's incidental. A lot of pictures like, quite interesting. The TSR gets a flat tire on the Indiana Tollway en route to Gen Con East in 1981. And this is courtesy of Merle and Jackie Rasmussen. Merle Rasmussen, best known for creating Top Secret, and you'll find a review of Top Secret on my blog, as well as a review of the Elusive Shift. Nice bit of humour. Office humour. Circa 1981, reinterprets the photograph of the groundbreaking ceremony for TSR's new manufacturing facility as an involuntary burial for Dave Arneson. he wasn't dead at this point. I should point out. So just something caught my eye. And then Bloom family tree marking those individuals who worked for TSR. So Blooms appear to have kept it in the family, as it were. So everything, I think, basically this will provide everything you want to know about the history of TSR. Yeah, Lorraine Williams, that was quite correct. All the way up, and it's got. There's also a. Let's have a look. You've got secrets, sources and acknowledgements, and annotations as well, basically footnotes or endnotes, I should say. They're quite lengthy, as you can see. We'll run a few pages, and then you get to the next, of course. So. As I say, been looking forward to reading this. Basically, another history of Dungeons and Dragons. Much more, I think, going to be perhaps you would call it revisionist, and I think that's not unwelcome, because essentially we are. I mean, Arneson and essentially Gygax have been dead, unfortunately, for a decade, and so it is worth going back and looking at that history. And I think, obviously, with the people who were involved at the time, apart from them basically getting older and older, it's worth talking to them and they'll tell you about what happened. And I think this is give you a chance to find out more yourselves. So that's Game Wizards, the Epic Battle for Dungeons and Dragons, available in all good retailers. Anyway, so if you have enjoyed this unboxing in the Nook, please do click the like button. And if you've got any comments or feedback, I look forward to reading them, and I will respond, and so on. And lastly, if you want to be alerted to yet more unboxings in the Nook, where you will see me back out here in the Nook with a package and a book or a game, which I will unbox and talk about to the best extent of my knowledge for roughly 10 minutes or so, all accompanied, of course, by a nice hot cup of tea. And on occasion, a cat which is not ours, then please do subscribe. In the meantime, thanks again for watching. I'll be back again soon with another unboxing in the Nook. Bye for now.